In this video, let's look at exactly how much Uber drivers and Lyft drivers make in 2025. So I'm on Gridwise right now. This is a great company that does a lot of research and testing when it comes to ride sharing, which is why I like that it's very independent, regardless of what Uber or Lyft might tell you. So let's go down here. This is a big thing. How much do Uber drivers make per week in 2025? An average of $513 per week, making them one of the highest earning gig workers, right? So Gridwise does focus on other gig economy type jobs. And I will say that Uber drivers and Lyft drivers, and I will say this, although this is specifically talking about Uber drivers, this also goes for Lyft drivers as well. There are some minor discrepancies, but typically what an Uber driver is going to make is the same as what a Lyft driver is going to make sometimes. But we'll talk about that a bit later in this video. But overall, it is one of the highest earning gig workers. There's a lot to unpack here, though, on this video. Now, let's talk about the hourly rate, because that's kind of vague, because $513 per week, but of course, it depends on how much you work. Now, in terms of the countrywide average, right, the average driver earns about $23.33 per hour in 2025. That, to me, honestly, is right in the average. When a lot of people ask me, how much do Uber drivers and Lyft drivers make? On average, I say between 20 and 25 an hour. So 23.33 is exactly in the middle of that. I guess technically a little bit higher, right? But in general, about $23 an hour is what you're going to make on average, period, right? But that's not the full story. Your location is the number one factor that determines how much money you can make as a driver. Now, right here, in terms of how much do Uber drivers earn per mile, is about 90 cents per mile in 2025. And this is a big thing. This figure suggests that while Uber pays well per hour, drivers may need to cover significant distances to maintain a steady income, especially in areas with lower, this got cut off, with lower ride. I'm assuming time. That's what I'd say. I'm not sure. But this is one thing I will say, and this is what's very unfortunate about being a driver, is that if, let's say, I have to go a mile down the road, but let's say it's crazy traffic, and it takes me 10 minutes to do that ride, I'm getting pennies. I mean, I remember driving in Boston even. There was one time I remember it was an hour and a half ride, but I only went, I can't even remember, like a few miles. They were doing construction on some bridge, and I think I made like $30 in an hour and a half. Just because although I was working for an hour and a half, I was just barely incrementing in terms of the distance, right? Distance has a big impact on how much money you can make as a driver, if not the biggest impact besides your location. So one thing I will say to all my drivers out there is that let's say you're in an area where going from point A to point B is typically a lot more driving in terms of mileage. That's going to be a lot better for your bottom line. Now, here's an interesting thing. Location-based earnings, like I said, where you drive, like I said, is one of the most significant factors influencing earnings. In my opinion, it is the biggest. After all the research I've personally done, I've read well over 1,000 articles about Uber and Lyft income. I've interviewed well over 1,000 drivers. I think it's the biggest, right? Cities with dense populations, constant demand, and regulatory frameworks that support drivers tend to offer higher pay. So I'm going to say things like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Boston, as you can imagine, big, popular cities with a lot of hustle and bustle, so to speak, typically pay more. And, of course, the legal status. So, for example, here in California, for example, rider drivers have a minimum hourly guarantee. In Massachusetts, which in my opinion, if I had to pick the best state right now, I think Massachusetts is actually the best when it comes to what they offer their rider drivers. You have minimum hourly guarantees as well. You have paid sick leave. You have a lot of other benefits, right? So the frameworks in a given area can actually have a huge impact as well. Just whenever you drive, however you drive, you always have kind of like a minimum guarantee or something, or unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the big thing, which we're going to talk about in depth. The gross earnings versus net income. Basically, how much money are you making per hour? So on average, 23 an hour. But what are your expenses? And that's one of the biggest negative things about Uber and Lyft. That's why although they say here, it has one of the highest hourly rates of any gig economy type job, which is true, there's a lot that you have to factor into because you have to spend money to make money, right? So in terms of expenses, I'm just going to go through these really quick. Fuel, maintenance and repairs, insurance, depreciation, cleaning and car washes, mobile phone and data plan, although I think most people do have a cell phone, but might as well mention it, and factors affecting income. We're going to talk a lot about this in depth after looking at this, but time of day of week, search pricing, acceptance rates, and a lot more can factor in all these little things of how much money you're actually going to bring in, right? Not just expenses, but all this other stuff. And then, of course, commissions and fees. Uber takes a 25% service fee for most trips. This percentage, though, which can be very unfortunate, can vary slightly depending on promotions, location, and ride type. And then last, but definitely not least, keep in mind you are taxed on your income, which is your whole other can of worms. So here's what it comes down to. On one end, super simple, to give you the shortest answer possible, about $23 an hour on average, if I had to give you a one-size-fits-all answer. But there's a million asterisks on that 23 an hour. First off, like I said, your location is the number one factor that determines how much money you can make, which is why I typically say 20 to about 25 an hour. For example, I was just in Miami. I found Miami drivers lean more towards the 20-ish an hour as opposed to other cities, right? So I think Miami maybe a bit less than average. If anything, I'd say Miami, if I had to be super specific, about $21, $22 an hour, right? So a bit lower than this average, right? Other cities, though, in my opinion, like Boston, LA, San Francisco, San Diego, the amount you're going to make per hour is actually going to be a bit higher, right? So, again, there's a huge spectrum of how much money you can make. But here's the biggest thing. Besides how much money on average you can make per hour, one, it does depend upon the app. Now, I will say for each city, and this could be a hours-long video, for each city, there is minor differences between Uber versus Lyft, right? On this particular article, they're just talking about Uber. I think one, because Uber is pretty much the most popular, and two, maybe it's a bit better for SEO. Like more people want to know how much does an Uber driver make than how much does a Lyft driver make, right? So I think it's more of an SEO thing when it comes to GridWise. But this is why I suggest to all my drivers, make sure you sign up with both apps. Remember, it's free to sign up. I know it sounds stupid to say, but it's free to sign up, free to drive for both. There's no quota. It's not like Lyft says, hey, you only did 3 rides last month. We're going to deactivate you now because you didn't do the minimum threshold. No. You could drive however you want, whenever you want. And the big thing is, on some weekends, Uber might pay more because of a promotion. On other weekends, Lyft might pay more because of a promotion. You never know. So sign up with both. So I will say that there are minor fluctuations, and this is what I suggest for a lot of drivers too. In general, I know some cities, Lyft definitely pays more, and in other cities, Uber definitely pays more. But overall, I still think about $20 to $25 an hour on average works for both Uber and Lyft. And like they said here, $23 an hour sounds about right in terms of a one-size number to fit all in terms of the global Uber and Lyft income, period, right? The big thing, though, and I think this is where a lot of drivers watching this video can say, hey, okay, yeah, it looks good on paper. 23 an hour, whenever you want, however you want. You just jump in your car and make money. The expenses, I think, is really where things start to really add up in the negative way, that really bring down how much money you're actually taking in, because you're talking about wear and tear on your car, right? Your car is going to be worth less. If let's say you drive for Uber and Lyft, and let's say you put on 10,000 miles on your car, and let's say you stop driving. But when you go to resell your car, well, that car is going to be worth less because of depreciation. In addition, let's say if you never sell your car, let's say you want to drive it into the ground, so to speak, well, those 10,000 miles mean that your car is going to kind of crap out, for lack of a better phrase, a lot sooner because of all that depreciation, right? Wear and tear. You're going to have to get more oil changes. You're going to have to get more maintenance on your car, like brakes. You're going to have to get replaced a lot more. You're going to have to get your tires replaced a lot more, like all the different elements of having a car. And then lastly, of course, gas. Gas is probably the biggest thing when it comes to being an Uber driver and a Lyft driver that, as we all know, you have to constantly replace over and over and over again. Unless you drive like a Tesla or an electric vehicle, you're going to have to constantly be getting gas over and over and over again. And this is what's really unfortunate about Uber and Lyft, because then you look at things like rideshare insurance as well. You know, I've talked about this in a lot of videos. They briefly mentioned it here. Then on top of your normal auto insurance, which you should have, you should also have rideshare insurance, because if you get into an accident, if something happens, even with a passenger, you never know. You want to make sure you're covered, not just for normal driving, but for rideshare driving. And a lot of insurance companies will not cover you if something happens when you're driving for Uber and Lyft, because in their mind, and I hate to say it, I kind of get it, you're not necessarily just driving per se, you're working, you're doing a job that directly relates to driving, which is why you need extra rideshare insurance on top of this. And I think that's where things get really difficult, because when you look at all these expenses of gas, maintenance on your car, rideshare insurance, you know, all these other little things that just pop up with being a rideshare driver, you really do have to spend sometimes a good amount of money to make money. Now, your biggest expense overall is going to be that gas, like I mentioned, but even still, this does bring down your bottom line. And then in addition, on top of all this, when you then look at, like we briefly saw at the last point, taxes, right? That 23, even ignoring all these expenses I just talked about, is going to be taxed. So even though you're like, oh, 23 an hour, it's kind of one of those situations that seems great at first, but later down the line could bite you in the butt if you've never been an independent contractor. Because for most people, they're used to this situation of you get paid at your job and the paycheck you're taking home, the amount that you're seeing has already been taxed. So you're putting in that paycheck or it's direct deposit or whatever. And then when tax time comes around, you get a big lump sum back. And you're like, oh, this is great. You're getting a bunch of money back, right? And so when you see money on a paycheck, most people are used to it already being taxed. But then when you're an independent contractor, when you're driving for Uber and Lyft, for example, when it's tax time, you're going to owe money to the IRS. And a lot of people are not used to that. You're going to have to hire a tax accountant. Definitely please do so. You're going to have to keep track of all your receipts. Anything that you spend related to Uber and Lyft can be a write-off. You're also going to have to save money. So I'd say on average, for most drivers, save between 25 to 30% of your income. Put it in a savings account. Don't touch it. So if you look at, like, say I'm making things up, like say you're making on average $24 an hour, I take between $5 to $8 of that hourly income, put it in savings, right? So if I make, like say $100 driving for Uber and Lyft, I may take 25, put it in a savings account, I don't touch it. In my mind, I just pay taxes, right? Because when tax time rolls around, that money's gonna go to the IRS. And if you're not used to that, if you're not used to having the, which I might even call financial responsibility of making sure that, you are keeping track of everything, that you're not going to see $1,000 in your savings account and go, oh, well, I have $1,000. Maybe I could use that for something or a rainy day. But it's like, no. Technically, that's not your money. It's the IRS's money, right? So there are a lot of factors that really do determine and factor into how much money you're really bringing home. Because on top of all this, I hate to say it, I think it might be between, and this is what I've seen through other meta-analysis and reports, anywhere between $12 and $17 an hour after everything's factored in terms of taxes, the expenses, the depreciation on your car, the gas you're spending, $12 to $17 an hour. Now, on one end, to be able to get up, make that anytime, anywhere, okay, not the worst thing, but one big thing I have talked about in a lot of videos, and I know right now I think I'm bashing Uber and Lyft pretty hard. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are a lot of benefits to being a driver. I've done a lot of videos about the benefits of being a driver. I've done an entire video about, should you be a driver in 2025? I have it listed below in the description. I've also done videos about, pro tips. So there's a lot to being a rideshare driver. And don't get me wrong. It's not all bad. I think there's a lot of benefits. And love them or hate them, Uber and Lyft has created millions of jobs. Millions of jobs of people who, like say, were not going to have a job at all and not being able to work. But the thing that it comes down to, and one thing I say to a lot of people is, I think right now, in this day and age, in 2025, the gig economy is super popular, right? I mean, there's a lot of people looking to make a quick buck in terms of some type of gig economy type work, an on-demand job. And I also have a bunch of, I have one video, again, in the description. I have a few videos in the description. But one of them, I talked about a bunch of different gig economy type jobs like Uber and Lyft. That video is about an hour long. It was an insane amount of research. So watch that if you want to. But one thing I'll say is this. $12 to $17 an hour, right? After everything. Okay, not horrible. But then, like I've talked about in so many videos, if I compare that to like an In-N-Out worker, in case you know, In-N-Out is a fast food chain primarily on the West Coast, they make about $20 to $22, $23 an hour as a fast food worker, right? And they get benefits after 90 days. They have, of course, taxes are way easier. You don't have to spend money to make money as well, right? In the sense that you just have to commute to the In-N-Out restaurant and then come back. So I think what's tricky about Uber and Lyft right now in 2025 is on one end, 23 an hour is not bad. Even with expenses and everything, I don't think it's bad, but here's the thing. Here's the big catch. I started driving, or I signed up for Uber and Lyft 10 years ago when I first got into the rideshare world, so to speak. That was I think it was December of 2024, 10 years ago. I started actually driving in January or February, around that time of 2015. So almost exactly 10 years ago, at the time of this video, I started driving. And here's the thing. When people asked me way back in the day, a decade ago, how much money did you make as a driver? I said, about 20 to 25 an hour. That was my answer 10 years ago. And what's kind of wild, as you can imagine, is 10 years later, that answer has really never changed. And I think that's one last big point I do have to bring up on this video, that although, yeah, $23 an hour on average isn't horrible, not bad at all, you know, especially with the on-demand feature of Uber and Lyft. In case you didn't know as well, you can do instant cash outs, which means if I make $100 driving, I hit a button, boom, that money instantly in my bank account. There's a lot of benefits to Uber and Lyft, like I said. But here's the thing. Here's the last big point I want to make, is that, let's say, take this average of Gridwise, like they said, $23 an hour. That $23 an hour, that $20 to $25 an hour on average, hit way harder and hit way better 10 years ago in 2015 than it does now in 2025. And I think that's what's kind of unfortunate, is that with the increase of inflation and all this kind of stuff that's going on, as we all know, the economy, well, especially in 2025, is looking a bit rocky, you know, with everything going on, it just doesn't hit the same. There's no other way to word that. Now, granted, if, let's say, it increased, and for most jobs, right? For example, I used to be an accountant. As most of you know, I do a lot of accounting videos on this channel. When I first started as an accountant in September of 2012, my starting salary was $57,000 a year as an auditor. September of 2012. In 2025, I'm not going to lie, I don't know exactly how much the starting salary is exactly of an auditor in Boston at the Big Four. I'm not sure exactly, but I guarantee it's higher, right? It might be $65K now as a starting salary. I don't know, but salaries increase to adjust for inflation. With Uber and Lyft, though, that's not the case. I mean, and if anything, back in the day, Uber and Lyft, like we mentioned here, back in the day, they used to take a 20% cut. That was it. If I make $100, Uber and Lyft takes 20, I get 80. Now, though, as we saw from the article, Uber takes out 25%, similar to Lyft. Sometimes as high as 30%. It can fluctuate. There's a fluctuating amount of the percentage they take out of your earnings. That's another unfortunate thing. That's almost like, wait a minute. So I'm making about the same money, same amount of money per hour as 10 years ago, but expenses are higher. Gas is more expensive. Maintenance on your car is more expensive. I now have to get rideshare insurance, which back in the day wasn't really a thing. Now you kind of have to have it. I have to spend money on taxes when it comes to this. And on top of all this, Uber is taking out a bigger percentage of my earnings. So I'm walking away with less money. And this less money I'm walking away with isn't hitting the same as before because of inflation, that milk is more expensive. Eggs, well, of course, are more expensive now. Right now we're going through this huge egg spike and everything. Maybe it's over. I don't know. Anyway, things are more expensive. Groceries, day-to-day living. I mean, a drink at a bar, it's kind of crazy now. It's not that uncommon here in LA for me to go to a bar, order like the most basic drink. I mean, vodka soda, take a very bare minimal drink with Well vodka. In case you didn't know, Well means like the cheapest that they have. So if I say Well vodka, that means give me your cheapest vodka and soda. I've gone to some bars in LA that's $20 for a Well vodka, right? Back in the day, it was like 10 years ago, right? So the money that you're making from Uber and Lyft is not only less, not only when you factor in the hourly income, which is about the same as 10 years ago, but all these other expenses and the percentage Uber and Lyft is taking out, you're walking away actually with less money than 10 years ago. But also this less money you're walking away with from 10 years ago is not driving you, but like is just not being able to get you as many items, or it's not as useful as before. I know a lot of different side tangents on this video, but that's why I want to make this a more in-depth video than just being like, oh, how much does an Uber driver make an hour? Or Lyft driver too? 23. Boom. That's what most people want to know, which is why I talked about it right in the beginning of this video. But when you factor in all these other things, this is what's making, I'm going to be honest, a rideshare driver less appealing as time is going on. This is also why I'm going to be blunt on this video. Why on this channel, I have kind of pivoted, right? This channel used to be only ride sharing. That was it. Uber and Lyft, sometimes some Uber Eats stuff, sometimes some gig economy type stuff, but really just ride sharing. That's why I've now transitioned into doing other videos about making money, whether it's in accounting, whether it's on YouTube, making money online, you know, financial stuff, and a lot more. Because the way I'm looking at it is, although I think ride sharing has never been bigger, which is awesome. I think that's huge. Ride sharing is now one of the biggest staples of our society. Like imagine tomorrow, or even now, if ride sharing just went away. That'd be devastating. The millions of jobs would be off the table. People using Uber and Lyft to get into and from their work, to go out, like saying they want to be responsible when consuming alcohol and they don't want to be driving. I mean, there's so many things that Uber and Lyft is now intertwined with when it comes to our society That being said, as big as ride sharing is now, it is never more unfortunate that Uber drivers and Lyft drivers are just not getting the income they deserve. And although at first, 23 an hour sounds pretty good to work however you want and whenever you want, when you look at everything, all these expenses, all the percentages of the way Uber and Lyft takes out your income, the fact that you're spending taxes on that too, right? It's not taxed, at least not yet, so to speak. You're walking away with not that much money, especially compared to before, and that money is just not hitting the same as well, making it, unfortunately, in 2025, one of the most tricky times to drive, because although there's a lot of pros when it comes to being a driver, I think there are a lot of pros, there's just a lot of cons as well.